So welcome to Grail Country. I have my guest today is Dr. Chris Green, who is a theologian and priest in the Continuing Anglican Movement. His church is in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Dr. Green, thank you for joining me today. I propose that we talk. I had read your book, All
Yeah,
Things Beautiful, an Aesthetic Christology, and I propose today that we talk about the theology of beauty,
let's do
which
it.
is clearly a subject that you address in this book
Yeah.
through a Christological lens. So why don't you just go ahead and tell me what you had envisioned when you wrote that book and what your thoughts are about beauty when it comes to theology?
Yeah. I tend to write in order to learn. I am a teacher, but I delight in the work of learning, studying. And I kind of for a long time had these kind of unsettled thoughts and feelings about beauty. One of them, and right at the heart of the book, is this argument that beauty will not save the world, right?
Right.
And in a lot of the circles where I move, that phrasing, beauty will save the world, had come up. I'd used it myself in sermons and classes, but it had always kind of not quite squared with me in whatever way. So I would say probably, who knows for sure where it started, but I think the idea for the book may have started with that sense of unease about what is the relationship between beauty and salvation. What is the truth of the hope that beauty will save the world? I think and I talk about this some in the book, as you know, but I remember years and years ago preaching a sermon because I had kind of noticed this tension between two texts about inquiring after the beauty of the Lord in his temple in the Psalms, and Isaiah's declaration that the servant has no beauty that we should desire him. And so I think for for a very long time I've sensed that question, how do they relate, right? How do they hold together? And then when I started reading Robert Jensen, who's a major influence for me, he was the first theologian I had read who seemed to kind of sense that paradox or that antinomy and to try to find a way to articulate it. I didn't realize at the time how he was able to do that. Now looking back, I think it was his Neo-Chalcedonian Christology, like his sense from Maximus and others that Jesus is the one in whom all good opposites coincide.
Right.
And that's how he was able to find language for it. But I think that's probably where it began, right? That if we're going to talk about beauty, a fellow Jensonian of mine, Steve Wright, has written a book about the theology of beauty, and Robert Jensen. He was also a major help for me in understanding what it was that Jensen was doing. I mean, Jens wrote a lot about beauty, and he always did it Christologically. So I would say those are the major forces for me. And I do talk about this in the book as well. I, from a very young age, I found that I was deeply moved by beauty. I mean, I say, as you know, that as a theologian, I'm a theologian who came to that work because of the arts. Right. I had experience, when I was very young in an art gallery, seeing a painting and being just kind of overwhelmed by it, not having any sense of why I was. In My wife and I went to a Pentecostal Bible school, and I still remember where I was seated when I read the first few lines of Moby Dick. I'd heard about this book, but I'd never read any of it. And we weren't even required to read the book for the class, but the opening lines came up somehow. The professor quoted them or gave a handout with them. I can't remember, but I just remember hearing those opening lines and like instantly knowing that I was having that same experience I'd had as a kid in the art gallery with Enoch Kelly Haney's Emptiness Has a Claim on Death painting. And so I would say that it's beauty that brought me to the work of theology. And then as a theologian, that's why I had an itch to try to find a way to talk about it that seemed to make a sense for me that I could live with.
Mm-hmm. So you say that beauty brought you to the work of theology in the first place. So why is it that you want to stop short and you do want to say, as in the chapter that in your book, that beauty will not save the world? What does it make you want to say that? I noticed that you spent quite a bit of time talking about Dostoevsky's The Idiot and the Holbein image of the dying Christ.
Yeah.
Or the dead Christ. The dead Christ. The reason I say the dying Christ is because I have, for Bulgakov in Sociology of Death, he talks about that same image.
Yeah.
And for Bulgakov actually explains that his initial reaction was much like Dostoevsky's, that this thing is unholy. But as he went through his own experience of dying that he talks about in Sociology of Death, he came to see it not as an image of death, but an image of dying, of frozen dying, of a dying that never ends. Because for Bulgakov, there's a difference between dying and death,
and being
dead,
because
death itself is the crossing through the threshold to the promise of resurrection.
Yeah.
So death does not have the same. There's more revulsion for him in the idea of dying than there is in death.
Yes. No, I've spent the last couple of years trying to write on dying, and that's a story unto itself, which we might get into. And Bulgakov is one of my sparring partners. I mean, there's a certain torturedness to the way he writes, and beauty to the way he writes about dying. So I you're right, though, to stay on task, that chapter is devoted, as all the chapters are, it's devoted to kind of a reading of some piece of art, in this case a novel, Dostoevsky's The Idiot. And as I read it, which I read it as a theologian, not a Dostoevsky scholar, it seems to me that The Idiot is not saying something that's true, or if it is true, it's true in a way no one really understands when he says that beauty will save the world. I mean, one of the things that strikes me is when you actually read the novel, he never quite says it. It's said that he says it. He's accused of having said it, but it's never really in his mouth and in a way that he owns, right? And of course, the novel ends rather bleakly. I mean, he's back in an asylum, and the world falls apart, right? So I think, standing on its own, there may be some way in which that phrase, beauty will save the world, where it might be true if all we mean is beauty is God will save the world.
Right.
True enough.
But,
right?
yeah, in that sense, it has to be true, because I mean, if beauty as such can only be God. So in that sense, it has to be true. I think your phrase where you talked about in a way that we cannot know, or maybe that we cannot even be known, I think that's where you're offering some pushback to the idea, is that you want to remind us that while that might be true, we don't have the ability to know beauty as such in this dispensation.
That's right. And so I think if we take some kind of facile reading of it, so I think, again, if we define the terms the way you've just defined them, then yes, I mean, that's synthetically true, right? That it has to hold that beauty will save the world, because God will, and God is beauty.
Right.
But if we don't do that, if we take a more kind of common sense read, I think at least it's easy to hear that as a statement that beautiful things will bring about the kind of change that needs to happen for the world to be better. And I think Dostoevsky's critiquing that. I don't think he's suggesting, right, that beauty of that kind will bring about the kind of redemption we expect it to bring about, right? That there's no way in which, just if we're around beautiful things. I mean, I know I talk about this in the book, as you know, but well,
because that beauty of that kind involves aesthetic judgment, where we're saying this is beautiful, but this thing is not. Whereas
that's part of it, yeah. But even if we could insist that there's some sense in which it's beyond our judgment. Well, let me come at it like this. So, what Steiner says about Nazis and aesthetics, I think, is to the point, right? That many of these, Goebbels, Hitler, of course, most famously, but German culture at the time broadly, I mean, it's deeply civilized. I mean, these are people who are singing Wagner, right? And they know Bach and Beethoven. They know they're poets. They
Yeah,
know.
but Nietzsche wasn't too happy about the Parsifal. He thought that was a betrayal.
Yeah. No, sure, absolutely. Yeah. Fair enough. But I think there's a way in which Steiner's point is that that he wanted to believe at some level of his soul. He wanted to believe that if you're capable of high culture, if you're capable of beauty in that sense, right, sophisticated poetry and music and architecture, that you will rise above the meanness of cruelty and abuse and so on. But I think
Yeah, you can
Scripture
see that in
already warns us
Heidegger
that.
too, I think. That's really
Yeah.
kind of where, like, Heidegger's turn to the poetic is that same kind of appeal.
Yeah, but I think if you're like I was, raised on the King James version and the story of Lucifer, you already have a warning against that, right? That he's the
Right.
beautiful one,
Yeah.
and out of that beauty rebels, right? So I mean, that's a
Yeah,
kind
I
of
was also raised Pentecostal, and I think Pentecostals have like a natural revulsion to that maybe other Christians don't
that's right.
necessarily have. Like there's a suspicion in
Yes.
Pentecostal circles more so than in other parts of Christendom.
Yeah. And I think, Nate, part of the reason why, and I've done a lot of thinking about this, I gave a series of lectures, I think it was last year, on Pentecostal aesthetics. And so in preparation for that,
Yeah, I found it.
Okay, very good. Yeah. So I'm thinking about this, have
Yeah.
been thinking about this. So one of the things that I argue there is that part of what was at the roots of that kind of Pentecostal suspicion of the arts, what some of it was class, right? That we thought the arts were for highfalutin, highbrow, wealthy, the elites, and we were not that, right? We were from the wrong side of the tracks. White, black, brown, whatever, we were too poor for that. So that's a dimension of it for sure. But also, I think theologically and spiritually, it was rooted in old Pentecostalism, old school Pentecostalism, like the kind that I was raised in, perhaps you were too. There was a devotion to the blood of Jesus, what Hohenweger calls a blood and wound mysticism, right? And that sense of Jesus, the broken one, the one who has no beauty that we should desire him, was so front and center for us that I think it constantly pushed back against any sense of cultured beauty, right? So there's a class dimension to it, but there's also a theological, spiritual one. So my sensibilities, I mean, no doubt were shaped by that. No doubt were, honed kind of in that.
That would suggest the thing you just said. Maybe I'm crazy to think this, but that suggests that there's something fundamentally Christian going on in some of the sensibilities of modern and postmodern art, because it's trying to extend the idea of the beautiful to embrace categories of things that we naturally have a revulsion toward.
Yes, I think that's right. Actually, Jamie Smith, who a fellow Pentecostal, has said that. I think it's in writing, but I've heard him say it in person for sure, that a Christian theology of beauty always has within it an understanding of ugliness as claimed by God.
Yeah.
Right. My words, not his, but that's, I think, exactly what he's suggesting, right? That God has made himself ugly for us, and in that way has sanctified ugliness, or at least aspects of ugliness, so that we can't just brush it aside, right? And that seems right to me. Again, there are all kinds of ways in which the Pentecostals that raised me would disown me now, not my flesh and blood, but
right,
many of the people I went to church with. But I still stand by that. Like I think that instinct, there's something really right about it, something really right about not letting that God's beauty cannot be reduced down to niceties.
Right.
That there's a certain kind of aesthetics that's about polish and niceties and sophistication, and God's beauty can't be cut down to that size.
Right. Well, there's a way in which, like, you cannot there can be no end to idolatry until God's image is seen in all things.
Yes, man, that's really well said, Nate. I completely agree, and I think that's the other side. You're intuiting the other side of this, why beauty will not save the world, because, and I think I say this in the book, if I didn't, I should have, that because beauty has to itself to be saved, right? The beautiful has to be made beautiful with his image, and that's what I'm pushing for, what you just said, that his image, the image of the crucified, has to be seen in all things, and including all that is beautiful. And I mean, that's my Pentecostalism, but that's also Jensen. I mean, that's Jensen's sense that beauty is essentially the shining forth of the beauty of Jesus, the crucified one. And again, I'm convinced that's right.
Yeah, like to me, that's connected to the idea of the redemption of eros. Like it has to, there has to be a connection there. It can't be it can't be all agape. Like there has to be something in our longing and in our desire itself that has to be transformed and redeemed, as you say.
Yeah.
So
that's right. I'm in agreement with that. So I think, to circle back to that question you asked a few moments ago, like why stop short then of saying beauty will save the world? I think it's because I want to emphasize that beauty in the abstract, beauty as a category of creaturely experience, that has to be redeemed. I want to keep the emphasis on the person of Jesus, right?
Right.
He is the beautiful one. He gives beauty its beauty.
I don't know. I don't know if this was just subconscious, but in your lecture on Pentecostal aesthetics, which I did catch online, I noticed that you mentioned smooth a couple times. So is like, are you potentially what you're doing here is something in the direction of like Plato talks about the confusion of the beautiful and the smooth? Is that kind of, I don't know if you had that in mind, if you were just kind of intuiting that, and it really went, and you were saying that, and you were also talking about some of like the rough edges.
I
Pentecostal aesthetics.
I am intuiting that. Like I did not, I mean, you're right that Plato does, but I had somehow just kind of taken that in. I was not explicitly trying to make that connection.
Right.
No, that is what I'm after. Yes, absolutely.
Right. Okay.
Which is why, for me, and again, I'll be the first to stand in line and critique my own tradition, but I think the aspect of Pentecostal aesthetics that seems to me to be rightly Christianized is that sense that the rough edges are signs of his cross, right? That there is a line in the liturgy that, now as a priest I pray, he stretched his arms out on the hard wood of the cross, like that's beauty for Christians. I think I don't mean that it can be limited to that, right? The grotesque or the absurd, but it can't not include that.
Right. It has to also include that. Yeah.
So the smooth, say more to me about that. Like how you hear that distinction.
Well, to me, okay, like in our contemporary culture, one of the areas where that's pretty obvious is if you look at like any kind of like glossy, like digital video footage. It's all smooth edges. There's no texture. Right. Everything is kind of smoothed out. And I think this is true of the way that, like, if you look at like images of food, people call it food porn. They call it that way for a reason. And then pornography itself like has that kind of like that same kind of look. It's just like, it's all just smooth edges, roundedness, that kind of thing. And
that's exactly right.
So this is the kind of, and AI art is only kind of driving that sort of aesthetic away from something that is not just smooth, that includes that which has, the rough edges and maybe even isn't immediately appealing to the eye.
That, man, absolutely. And there's so much I want to say there. One is that I think that's true audibly, like the ways in which my Apple Music plays lossless sound, right? Like it's smoothed away.
Auto tune, the ubiquitous use of auto tune. It's like this is
So there's that, but then there's also a way in which, as an artist, I am drawn to reclaim those spaces and rough them up a bit. So I do a lot of digital art,
right?
In part because I want to say, no, like this space needs an edge on it, right? It needs some of the hardwood of the cross. If we can come back to that image, I think, that's certainly at stake for me.
Yeah. Well, I think like, and that's like sometimes like I've had a few experiences where um I feel like it was God calling my attention to something that maybe like I was unwilling to see the beauty in at first, where
Mm.
I've just had these like momentary glimpses where it feels like I'm seeing someone not the way I was inclined to see them at first, but in this brief glimpse, I'm seeing them the way I think God must see them. I've had this experience a few times. I had one time I was being really irritated by this homeless guy on the bus when I was trying to read. And he was like, kept asking me like what book I was reading.
Right.
And he reeked of alcohol and he
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
harassing me and I wanted no part of him. And it's like, I just looked up from my book for a second and nothing about the situation changed, but I saw him like somehow he just seemed radiant and beautiful to me
Yeah.
in that brief moment. And then he went right back to being
Right.
the same obnoxious
Yeah.
guy who was,
Yeah.
and it was just for that, just for that, just for that brief moment.
Hmm. Yeah.
So
But that reminds me of, I think, gosh, his name is slipping my mind, but um, there's a composer. I heard him give a lecture once, and he was talking about his process, like how he comes to write the music he writes. His name will come to me in a moment. Since I had the stroke, I have all kinds of gaps with names that's frustrating, but I guess that's part of the edge that I have now. But he was talking about his process, and he said that often he will have musicians play for him to the extremity of their ability. That he'll write music he knows is too hard for them to play, to pull them to the edge of it. And he does this, he said, for several reasons. One is, and he will do this in live performances as well. He said, because if the audience knows that there is real risk, they attend differently, right? That there's a chance that these world-class musicians are not going to get every note right, like because it's so difficult, so demanding,
right.
that it requires a different kind of attention, both from the musicians and from the audience. I'm really struck by that. But
No,
he also,
right. So there's a way in which the beauty we look for is the beauty of perfection.
mm-hmm,
And what maybe God is wanting is more of a wholeness.
yeah, yeah, and a wholeness that is real in the sense that we sense the risk in it, in a sense, right? Now, I think ultimately risk, we'd have to talk about what I do and don't mean by it, but there's a sense of aliveness, like of in the present momentness to it, that I think you lose with our smoothed out accounts of perfection.
Right.
And I think that's true Christologically, and it's true aesthetically, it's true pastorally, and right on down the line. So like, but he in passing, he made this statement that as a composer, I have to be able to hear the music musicians are trying to play, to hear the music. I think that's what saints are able to do. Like what you had in that moment, for just a moment, was you heard the music God was playing in that man. Just one note of it maybe, but you heard that note.
Right. Yeah. No, I've seen images before where it's like where it shows like, it shows a saint and then it shows like a bunch of other people and it's trying to show the saint's point of view and it's just Jesus. It's
Mm.
like just the saint.
Yeah.
The saint is just
Right,
able
yeah.
to see
Yeah.
Jesus everywhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
So
and hear it and
image
smell
of
it
Christ
and
in all
sense it.
things.
Yeah, absolutely. And so yeah, that's how it wraps back, right? What you were saying about salvation is the image of Christ coming to be in all things. Well, then saints, of course, are the people who can already see that, who
Right.
can sense it and know how to be present to it.
Which means that the beauty is presence if you have eyes to see.
Yeah.
So
That's what Jensen says, right? So he makes this connection between beauty and glory,
mhm.
and glory is weightiness. And he says beauty is just God throwing his weight around, right? It's the weight of God's presence kind of hitting us in one way or another. And I love that. I mean, I think that's it. And it can happen at any time.
Mhm.
And there's nothing in creation, to come to my Pentecostalism, I was raised in Pentecostal circles that at their worst were legalistic and moralistic, not just ready to critique high culture, but out and out anti-intellectual and anti-aesthetic. And one of the ways in which I think we got that most wrong is we thought that there were huge swaths of the world God would never show up in, right? That it was so wicked, so given over, that there was no way anything, could anything good come out of anywhere but Nazareth. That was our conviction, right?
Right.
Nowhere is safe but Nazareth.
Right.
And I remember once having this realization that there's a relationship between our art and our prayers. And if there's anything that we refuse to face artistically, we will refuse to give voice to it in prayer. Like if there's anything in poetry or film or architecture or song that's off limits, that I just cannot be addressed by anyone in any way, then that means those things could never be in our prayers. We don't know how to pray about them or how to give voice to them. So I haven't fully sounded all that's there, but I do believe that art and prayer, when they're done faithfully, if I can use that term, they're rising from the same place for the same purpose.
Right.
And it is about the image of Christ being brought to bear in all things, and truly in all things.
Yeah, I have a video on my channel that's called Poetry, a Conversation with Being. That's very much like talks about the connection between poetry and prayer.
Yeah.
And that ultimately what a poet is attempting to do is to have a dialogue with being.
Yeah.
Regardless of what their faith is. It's like that's why they're putting it out there.
Yeah. And I would say you said, I mean, this is a quibble, but your point about what they're trying to do. I mean, I think part of what makes poetry is that there's always more going on than what the poet can try to do.
Absolutely.
Right. And I mean, if it's not yet poetry, right? It's something trying to be poetry. But if poetry gets there is this sense in which, oh yeah, I don't know all that's just happened, right? And it's not, it's not accidental that the prophets are poets. Israel's prophets are poets, right? And that God himself among us, speaks in these ways that are unforgettable. When the Gospels say no one spoke like him, this is what they're naming, right? That his words are so charged, there's such a liveliness to them, and a kind of enchanting darkness to them, that everything he says is captivating. And I wish we hadn't, and here by we I mean the folks that raised me, I wish we hadn't overreacted against what we thought of as worldliness so fiercely that we lost that sense that all creation is God's, and it all sings or can sing if you listen.
Right. Yeah, I know what you're talking about. I mean, like I said, like that's I was raised in Assemblies of God church. My grandmother on my great grandmother on my mom's side had been a very early Pentecostal minister. She was an ordained minister in the Pentecostal Holiness Church.
Yeah.
That's
the denomination that I was raised in, Pentecostal Holiness Church.
She was from Henrietta.
Oh, of course. I've been to that. I've spoken in that church.
Yeah. So I'm a scion of Alabama and Oklahoma on both sides. So my dad's dad is from Oklahoma City, Midwest City. And my dad's mom is from Huntsville, Alabama.
Yeah.
And then my mom's mom is from Henrietta, Oklahoma, and her dad is from Coleman County, Alabama. And she was raised in Coleman County. My mom grew up in Coleman County, Alabama.
Yeah.
But I'm a Sooners fan, though.
Oh, nice.
It's a guy from my grandfather. Yeah. I remember J.C. Watts when he was still a football player.
Nice. Yeah. Me too, actually. So I think there's so much of this that I'm still sounding, as I just said. In fact, it's not written up in that book because it wasn't finalized yet, but that's going to be the first of a trilogy. Okay. And I'm finishing up the second of the trilogy now. So it's going to be, Lord willing, as we say, and the creek don't rise in Oklahoma, where there'll be this book, the Aesthetic Christology, the one that I'm finishing up now, which is a biblical Christology, which is a kind of Christological read of Israel's stories of journey. So pilgrimage and wandering and exile and return. So that will be done soon. It'll be out hopefully this fall. And then the last one will be a dogmatic Christology, which I was worked out in a little more systematic terms. So that's in the works, hopefully, well on its way to being done. And I'm hoping that when the three of them are read together, you get a fuller sense of kind of what, I mean, this is about Jesus for me. This is about Jesus. And I'm very much writing from what I've known. I mean, some of the pushback on that book that we're talking about tonight, on this book that we're talking about tonight, has been the kind of arbitrariness of which artists I engage, and which critics. And I'm unapologetic about that. I can't read everything. I haven't read it. I haven't seen every movie, right?
Right. No.
And so I can only engage.
Lots of Terrence Malick, though. I approve.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. I mean, and that's cliche, but I'm unapologetic. Again, I don't, if you're bothered by that, I mean, this book is not for you, right? Which is fine. I can't write for everyone. So I am, again, working through these various disciplines in pretty, undisciplined ways, because I'm drawn to Jesus, right? I think he's lovely. And that's, again, I think the best of the spirituality that I was given was that kind of love for Jesus, with all that was wrong with it. And there was a lot that was wrong with it. There was at least this sense of intoxication with Jesus that I don't want to lose.
Right. Yeah. And I think it's healthy to realize how much it shaped you. That's to me lately, that's something that's been dawning on me lately, is that as far removed as I am from it now, to realize how much my Pentecostal upbringing shaped who I am and my sensibilities. There's no denying that. As much as for years I would have definitely wanted to deny that.
I did what I could to wash it out. Yeah. One of the things that, and man, this tells me that I'm getting old, but also that the world is changing so quickly. If we hadn't been raised, you and I, when we were in those circles, we wouldn't have known this, because I think the Pentecostalism that exists now is markedly different than the one that was there when I was a kid and when you were a kid. It's changing so fast into something too smooth, far too smooth and generic.
Yeah.
And I lament that. I mean, I think there's and it shows itself in the aesthetics too, right? That, as you heard in those lectures, Pentecostal preaching and singing, even Pentecostal architecture, like the tent, the revival tent, the brush arbor, even those, I mean, holiness and Pentecostal folks, there was an aesthetic. I mean, you could make a movie like The Apostle that's true to that aesthetic, or even Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? These are films that are drawing up on a certain kind of folksy religion that resonates, right, with what I grew up with. But most of that has been mega churched out of us, right? It's been smoothed out by Christian television and the kind of omnipresence of the mega church model, which is, I think, stripped all of that away, which is tragic.
Well, it turns the church into a business. I mean, it's a church's business model, which is, I just don't know what to say about that. Yeah. So, yeah. I have a question. I want to get back to this. This is actually, believe it or it might seem like a sidetrack, but it's getting back to talking about beauty. So I don't think beauty is the only transcendental we're confused about, right? So we obviously we both agree that if we're talking about beauty as such, then obviously the statement that beauty will save the world is correct. I think that in modernity, we very much, maybe not as much in Pentecostal circles, but certainly within mainline Protestant circles, there came to be very much a truth first approach. But I think we're deeply confused about truth, because you've heard the saying truth is power. I really think that this is something that people fundamentally believe, is this idea that truth is power. But to me, power is actually the root of all idolatry. And this is something I suspect, given the things I've heard you say in some of your sermons and some of your lectures about violence,
Yeah.
I suspect this is something that you were inclined to agree with.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I may be too radical on this point, even for you, Nate. I mean, I think my argument is, and here I'm drawing, deeply from Gregory of Nyssa and others, and we can talk about, influences here. But there are a couple of things I want to say about that. One is that God cannot do violence. God can be forceful, but God cannot be violent, in the sense that God cannot do violence to us. And I don't mean it in the Thomistic sense of, well, whatever God does is by definition what's true for me. I don't mean that. I mean everything God does by definition is my good, and therefore cannot be violent, right? It's not good because God does it. It's good in me because God is the one working it, right? And then the other thing I would say is, God is, not only do we not have violation or violence, we don't have mastery and slavery. That God is not a master. That when we say that Jesus Christ is Lord, we are making a radically prophetic statement about the way in which God rules, the way in which God's sovereignty is at work in the world. So I've done a lot of preaching and writing and thinking and talking about this, but you're right to say this is right at the heart of what I'm convinced of, right? That God is sovereign. Nothing happens apart from God's care, but God does not control. That metaphor is a misleading one for us, like a badly misleading one, because of what it suggests to us about power, and that power is having control, which I think, if that's what we mean by power, yes, absolutely, it's idolatrous.
Yeah, let me share. This is a little quote from this is a quote I wanted to share with you. This is from one of the books that we've been doing a series on my channel. It's from Valentin Tomberg's Meditations on the Tarot. He says,
Okay, I don't know it at all. Yeah.
Okay. The idol of power has such a hold on some human minds that they prefer a God who is a mixture of good and evil, provided that he is powerful, to a God of love who governs only by the intrinsic authority of the divine, by truth, beauty, and goodness, i.e., they prefer a God who is actually almighty to the crucified God.
Yeah. And so for me, when I say God is almighty, or when I read scripture saying God is almighty, or the liturgy, what I hear that to mean is God has all the might there is of that kind. That what we're calling mightiness is foolish to God. It's weakness. It's nothing against God's mightiness. So I think I would say God is almighty. God is sovereign. Nothing happens apart from God's loving care. But that is not the kind of control we would exert if we had what we think of as all power.
Which I think is what Tomberg is saying in that passage too, because he's saying it in the context of talking about how power itself is the root of all idolatry.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And he also wants to avoid the idea that there's any kind of mixture of good and evil in God.
Right. Yeah, and absolutely. It is astounding to me that has to be said, but absolutely, it has to be said, right? I mean, that God does not need evil to do good. I mean, I think, we're into a conversation about the problem of evil, aren't we? Right? That a lot of the kind of pop psychology / pop philosophy that's at work in the churches that I move in is this notion that God, because God is loving, God allows all kinds of evil, but he's right to allow it because he's going to make good from it. And I think that's just nonsense. I mean, God doesn't need evil to bring about good. So there's not only no evil in God, there's no way in which God's goodness is dependent upon evil for anything, even evil out external to him. And that's why I think we have to be radical about this point, right? That not only is God good and only good, God never works with anything but goodness, right? Like God never takes up evil as such to bring about something good. God's goodness is always at work against the forces of darkness.
So how do we reconcile that, something like that, with like the violence of the state?
Yeah,
I'm a Christian
Well,
anarchist and a pacifist, so you're not going to upset me if you.
yeah, I mean that is we're I mean this is our first conversation, so I have no idea like what territory I'm in, right? I
That's
have
why I'm
no
letting
idea.
you know you're on safe ground if you want to
Okay,
critique it.
fair enough. Um, so I want to make a distinction here between force and violence, and between measured force and unmeasured force. So I think I'm not an anarchist in that I think there is a case to be made that the state should have a measure of force that it can use for the good of the most vulnerable of its citizens, right? My father was a Marine and a police officer, right? But I do not think that can be violence and accepted by God. And what I mean by violence is a use of force that violates the humanity of anyone. And this is why capital punishment, disallowed by definition. That's a violation, right? I think there is a way to incarcerate some, but not the way that we do it. I mean, I think there are ways in which we could hold someone close. And let me use an analogy for this. I was in the airport once, and you know how sometimes someone will wrongly or at the wrong time open the door to the jetway, and the alarm will sound, and it's a obscene sound. And there was a young man there, probably in his 20s, at least my size, and he had a response, like he was autistic, I think, and it overwhelmed him, and he started thrashing around. He's a big man, I mean, young man, but
My
and his
son
mother,
is autistic and is 6'5", 340
there you
pounds.
go. I don't think it was
So
your son.
I don't have a hard time imagining.
So you know what I'm talking about, right?
Yeah.
And so you've almost certainly done this, Nate. Like his mother, I assume it was his mother, she essentially tackled him, right? She fell on him and held him until the alarm had stopped ringing, and he was able to kind of gather himself. Like, that's forceful, but there's no violation. In fact,
Right.
it's the force that's keeping him from doing violence to himself. So I think God has that kind of force, and therefore it is good to use that kind of forces of that kind. And I think it's at least possible and I think a state should aspire to that kind of force. But violence, no. Violence, no. And I don't think anything is going to be allowed for us that God himself would not do. It's not only not allowed, it's not necessary.
Mm-hmm.
I think I mean, whatever problems there are with Hannah Arendt, I mean, I think she's dead right about this, that much, if not most, of the wickedness that happens in our world starts or continues because good people, otherwise good people, convince themselves that these are necessary evils.
Right.
That we have to stomach this because we have no options. And I think that, and here's the conversation bringing us back to art, most of the evil that happens is a failure of imagination. It happens because of a failure of imagination, I should say.
Kind of brings us back to your book too, into the sections where you talk about the patterns of American storytelling.
Yeah.
And redemptive violence. And so the question is like, I think we talk ourselves into rather easily into, it's a fallen, like the argument usually goes something along these lines, like it's a fallen world.
Yep.
And sometimes the only options open to you, the only choices open to you are evil.
That's right. And Bonhoeffer, of course, gets drawn in right at that point to justify it.
Right.
And I just think we have to call that for what it is. I mean, that is satanic thinking. So I don't talk about this in the book, but let me say a little bit about
Let's hear it.
A distinction I've come to make. There's been all kinds of pushback on it, but I still think if you let me define the terms, you'll see what I mean. I think we have to distinguish between the demonic and the satanic in that evil works in those two ways always at the same time. So the demonic is evil as chaos, threatening to undo everything that we value, everything that we hold dear, right? So the demonic is always seeking to erode, overthrow, devour what is ours, right? what we hold precious. The satanic is using the demonic to set us up for deception, right? So the threat of the demonic gives the satanic a hearing.
Yeah, this is like Steiner's distinction between the Ahrimanic and the Luciferic.
Yes, it is. Although I had stumbled on this before I found that language.
Okay,
I mean, that's always happens to me. Like, no matter what ideas I've had, I find,
yeah, me too.
Someone else has had it before me and articulated it better. But yes, it is like that. That is exactly the kind of thing I'm talking about. And the way it hit me was actually the story of Legion. That here's a man whose life is completely demonized, right? Eaten up with darkness and chaos. But he runs to Jesus. It's the people in the village who run Jesus off because they've been satanized, right? In that they have a false order they want to keep. And they don't want Jesus bringing the true order that's going to throw their false order into chaos. So and this is why, I don't know if you remember Fulton Sheen.
There's some echoes of Girard there in what you just said.
Are. Yeah, that's for sure. But Fulton Sheen is this old Catholic TV evangelist. If you've not seen him, you should just
I have,
because it's hilarious, right? Him with his cape. But anyway, Fulton Sheen has this line in one of his sermons that Jesus is crucified between two thieves outside the city because the city cannot distinguish the threat he as a prophet brings from the threat they as outlaws bring.
Right.
That there's a way in which Jesus, the kingdom of God, is an order that threatens the orders of this world, even more than it threatens the disorders of this world. And this is why I think Jesus says to the Pharisees and the chief priests and the Sadducees, etc., the stakeholders, the prostitutes and tax collectors are going to enter the kingdom before you, because it's easier to get from disorder to the order of the kingdom than it is from the place of order, at least if you're at the center of it, false order, then
human hierarchies.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's why the rich young ruler cannot give up everything, right? And so I'm convinced that that's what's taking place in all this talk about, well, it's a fallen world, right? We're so afraid of the demonic, we almost immediately buy the satanic lie. Well, then you have to do these evils in order to protect yourself from the demonic. And what Jesus shows us is you don't have to protect yourself from the demonic, right? You may be killed, but it will just simply alter the use of death, to quote Maximus, right? Like this is what martyrdom means for Christians.
And we tell ourselves we're just going to do it this one more time.
Yeah.
So I was thinking about this in the context of the way you talk about the American storytelling, and one of the things that also comes from the way those stories end. Once the community has been reestablished in peace and order, is that and the hero is exiled, or in some cases dead, like in Shane, he's actually dead at the end. That we won't need to do this again. We had to do this time, but now we won't ever have to do this again, because so there's some kind of there's a fundamental acknowledgement of a Christian vision, and also the American idea of progress. Like we're still moving toward we're moving toward the kingdom. We had to do this bad thing because we had no choice, but we are disowning it, and we hope not to have to ever do it again.
Man, I absolutely right. And I think that that part of what I'm doing in those chapters, specifically on the Western and, the Daniel Boone myth, the leather stocking stories, all that stuff, like those. What
John Wayne on my checkbook. I know what you're talking about.
That it's become kind of, I don't know, it's become chic to say that the problem with American evangelicalism is it's too in love with John Wayne, and John Wayne then becomes a figure of violence and virile masculinity or whatever. But I don't think that. I think the story is more complicated than that. It's more mysterious. I mean, the story that we've told ourselves, like there's a real tragedy to it. I mean, that's part of what I'm trying to show in that chapter is in those stories, the hero is necessary to save us from evil, but he has to be willing to do horrible things so we don't have to have our hands or our conscience bloodied. That we don't want to have our hands or our conscience bloodied. That is a Christian instinct.
Right.
But it has been Satanized in that we think, well, in order for us to live good Christian lives, there have to be people who are willing to do very unchristian things. And you're right. I think one of
Well,
the
the
ways
Unforgiven makes this particularly clear, right? Because it's right there in the title.
Absolutely.
And there's the line where the guy tells him, "I'll see you at hell," and William Muddy says, "You probably will."
Yeah. Yeah.
So there's a full acknowledgement of that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, but there is that probably, right? There is this sense in which we don't quite know what to do with our saviors, because there's a bumper sticker all over my part of the world. I lived in Florida for a while. I live in Oklahoma now. I was raised in Oklahoma. I was in Central California for a while. I essentially move everywhere in the U.S. that's Oklahoma. like the Dust Bowl took Oklahomans to California, and
my grandfather ended up in San Francisco as a chef.
Yeah, right. So you know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And then of course Central Florida, where I was, I mean, it's just like Oklahoma it's just, it's hotter. There are more alligators, mosquitoes, and snakes, but it's the same culture in most ways. And so there's a militarism there, right? That there are only two people who've died for your sins or died for your freedom. Two people who've died for your freedom: Jesus and the American soldier, right? I grew up hearing, again, my dad was a Marine and a cop, but he was a discerning man, so he helped me navigate this even when I was young. But I mean, I grew up around people who would talk about worshiping at the tomb of the unknown soldier, right? Singing songs to Jesus at the tomb of the unknown soldier. I remember one time in particular hearing someone say, "I took my shoes off there because I was on holy ground," like that kind of stuff, right?
Right.
That is just an out and out mixing of militarism and violence, the satanic deception about the need to do violence with Christian sensibilities, right? I mean, it's terrifying, honestly, to think about. I mean, there was a point in my life when I didn't see it at all. Then when I started to see it, I was horrified of it. Then when I started to realize it was in me, I was far more horrified. And now I'm aghast, right? I mean,
it's absolutely in me. I don't come by my Christian anarchism and pacifism naturally. I spent most of my life between the ages of like 11 and 13 literally praying that I would outgrow my asthma so that I could have a career in the military. I wanted nothing more. Like, my ambition in life was to be a soldier. Yeah. I spent a good chunk of my adult life as a hawkish neocon. Yeah. So I mean, it's definitely in me.
Mm-hmm. And me too. And I want to say, because of the way it's mixed, there are all kinds of things in there that are good. At least they pull toward the good. So I don't dismiss, or I don't want to dismiss all of that out of hand. I really do think, though, that there's deep idolatry there.
Part of what's good in it, though, is to bring a little bit of nuance to what is good and who is good. Mm-hmm. So yes, this figure has to be exiled, but at the same time, it's challenging our notion of what goodness can look like.
Yes.
Because these characters are usually, rough around the edges and not fit to take to church on a Sunday. But yet, even though what they do is ultimately misguided, there's not no good in it at all.
That's right.
So there's something that expands the Christian mind about what goodness can be when you take a figure like Rooster Cogburn, mm-hmm. and that's the good guy.
Mm-hmm. That's right. No, I agree. I think the example I use in the book is Ethan from John Ford's The Searcher, John Wayne's character, who's at the end left out. I mean, the door is open, but he can't go in. He has to wander. And there is something, I mean, I think deeply Christian even about that sense of exile, like God's willingness to go into exile for us. I think what's unchristian about it is this sense that there must be a final divorce, right? So I did not expect this to go here, but this is my problem with Lewis's Great Divorce, mm-hmm. right? Which is a book that I loved when I first read it. I've gone back to it many times. But my fundamental difference with Lewis, I mean, my son is named Clive, if you want any indication of how I feel about Lewis. But I think that there is deeply ingrained, and here we're talking about something larger and older than America, that Lewis is embodying in that story. That at the end of the day, good and evil do have to be opposed. There has to be an eternal opposition of good and evil in order for either good or evil to have any sense. This is part of the reason I think people recoil against what they call universalism.
Yeah. And
why Lewis himself has to say, at the end, there is this great...
And put words in George MacDonald's mouth.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The great divorce. I mean, I think I still remember where I was when it hit me. Like, Lewis's eschatology is not of the marriage supper of the Lamb. It's of the great divorce. Like, it is a tragic vision. Like, he talks in Mere Christianity and elsewhere about the Christian is not tragic, because of resurrection, because of incarnation. But no. His vision is absolutely tragic. And I think the American mythology, the West, is a staging for that tragedy. That good won't make any sense if we don't have the contrast with evil. And again, I think that's wrong, but I don't think it's to be taken lightly or dismissed.
Right.
There is a weightiness to that wisdom. I think it's, at the end of the day, wrong, but it should not be brushed aside.
Well, I think what's good in it, here's where I'd say where the good is. The good is in it, in the killing is not good, right? That's fundamentally wrong. But the willingness to risk your life for the safety of others is commendable. That is good. So there is something that is I think we can all agree that is genuinely good. It's just the like the use of excessive force and the violence that makes it. My son made this observation. I was talking to him, and he was talking about how Gran Torino, the Clint Eastwood film Gran Torino, kind of subverts your expectation as to how it's going to go, because you think that, like, it's Clint Eastwood who's played these kinds of characters we're talking about many times, and that you think he's going to end up doing the violence, but instead he ends up suffering it.
Mm-hmm. That's right. And recognizing that what Jesus accomplishes, and not just illustrates, what he accomplishes, is that is in fact the way the world works. That, I'm going to be preaching Sunday on the Beatitudes. I think the ways in which we can see how deceived we've been is when we read the Beatitudes, we think, oh, wouldn't that be nice? But that's just not possible.
Right.
That's not how the world works. That's not the way things go in the quote unquote real world. But no. That is a description of how the world works. The Beatitudes are absolutely telling us this is the only thing that works.
Yeah, exactly. This is what Tom Berg says. What Tom Berg says is that the only deeds that are actually free deeds are the impossible ones. The one, like, so to love your enemies is a free deed.
Yeah.
Because it's impossible for you. You can only do it with grace.
Sarah Coakley makes that very point. Yeah. Sarah Coakley says, forgiveness is impossible. That's precisely, by definition, why we must do it.
Right. Exactly. Exactly.
So I think that's
there's nothing free about the things that we just do automatically. The choices that we think that we're making, most of them we just do without thinking. It's just automatic.
Mm-hmm.
So
no, man, I think that's right. And of course, now, as you know, we've moved from talking about beauty to truth, and now we're talking about goodness. Right. And our confusions about what is the good, and whether or not freedom is distinguishable from the knowing and doing of the good, true, and beautiful. I think one of the most persistent lies, and one of the reasons that it's so hard for us to escape this satanic account of violence and rescue, is we've come, and hereby I mean the folks in my world, have come to believe that freedom is the greatest good.
Right.
And what we mean by freedom is sheer autonomy, like sheer self-determination. And like until that is overturned or upturned, till that table is flipped, like we're going to keep money changing with these notions of good and true and the good, the true, and the beautiful. Because freedom, I think you and I don't know for sure, but I'm guessing you and I would agree. I mean, freedom just is knowing and being and doing the good, the true, and the beautiful. Like it is, that is what it means to be free. And that's why the impossible work, I haven't read, is it Tomberg?
Well, there's Tomberg. But Tomberg makes sort of an ontological argument for freedom that I think has some merit, where he says that essentially, if something has its freedom from another, there is no, you really can't say that it exists, because it only has its source of freedom. So there has to be some degree of autonomy, but that's not what we're talking about. I don't think that kind of autonomy is what we're talking about when we talk about freedom.
No,
so that's the problem. It's just the reason we confuse about freedom, I think, is that we clearly use the word in an equivocal sense to mean different things. So that's what makes it so complicated to talk about. So I would say, yes, there is some sense in which we are free, and that we are autonomous beings, that we don't depend on our freedom for another. God has given us genuine freedom. It's not illusory. We don't have, so we're not dependent on our freedom from another. But at the same time, in order to actually have, let's say, existential freedom as opposed to ontological freedom, that only rests in the good, the true, and the beautiful, in God.
Well, but see, I'm saying for me, and this is my Jensonian influence again, the ontological and the existential are one, in the way that the economic and the immanent are one in God, right? That the Rahner's rule, right, essentially applied to this. So I think what you're saying about equivocation, though, is just to the point that in my circles here, middle America, middle class, working class Protestant culture, right? I mean, I don't know all the stipulations to identify it rightly, but the world that I've known, that I've lived and moved and had my being in, like in that world, I think freedom is the transcendental. Like it transcends everything. It's that to which God has to answer. It's that to which we have to answer. All things have to answer. And I think the equivocation is required by what we've done with it, right? So we've hyper trans.
Well, I think you can especially see this in the way that contemporary defenders of the doctrine of hell will resort to freedom as their fundamental thing, which none of the earlier proponents would have done. That's the thing about it that's weird. Is like that's really very much that's
not a traditional argument. Yeah,
it's not a traditional argument at all. But it's kind of the go-to for contemporary defenders of it.
And that's back to the point I was just making about the tragic vision that grips us, right? So this is, and I'm far from the first to point this out, but that modern myth of progress, when it's saying all of this about progress, but if you step back for just a moment, you realize it's sustained, it's energized by this deeply felt sense of the tragic, that ultimately that we're headed toward this great divorce, not the marriage supper, but toward the great divorce. And that, I mean, some rejoice in it. Lewis at least had enough character not to rejoice in it. He grieved it.
Right.
But that seems to me fundamentally wrong, because what it tells you is the reality is constituted somewhere other than the life of Jesus, right? Because in Jesus, all good opposites coincide. In Jesus, all bad opposition is overcome. In the Chalcedonian definition tells us, right? I mean, it's all in him, all things hold together, and he is all in all. So if that's true, then we can't be headed toward some great divorce, right? And whatever freedom is, then it must be some way in which we can freely join that intimacy that's promised.
Right. Yeah.
And I think if we're accounting for freedom in any other way, we're going to keep going wrong on all of these fronts, and not just wrong philosophically. Like our lives are going to continue to be shipwrecked.
Well, let me ask you this then. What do you make of the notion of God choosing in light of that?
Well, say a little bit more. I mean, I think I know where you're
Well,
going. Let me
yeah,
make sure
I
I'm
mean,
tracking.
it's like, so I think when people think about God choosing, for people who do think that God, for people who insist that God chooses, right?
Mhm.
They seem to think of God's choice being somewhat like our choice, where there is a menu of options which are available,
Yeah, yeah.
that there's a yes and a no possibility, and that God chooses between the yes and the no,
Mm.
like we do.
That I don't even think we do, honestly. I think we have the illusion of that. God certainly does not. I mean, we better hope he doesn't. Like, I
But
think
but I think there's a way in which we can recover the idea of God choosing, but I think that God's choice is always the affirmative.
Mhm. Yeah. I mean, so here's what I would, as I'm, and I hear, and this is contested, I know, and but like, so I'm with the reading of Maximus that Jesus does not have a gnomic will, in the sense that he's not making choices the way we make choices. He knows the will of God and he does it. Right. I was just talking with a friend about this. So the way that I read the temptations in the wilderness is that there is not existential dread for Jesus in those moments. That he is, in a sense, laughing off what's being offered to him because he sees through it all the way. Like, I think there is real agony in the garden, but not in the wilderness. There's hunger, but if you read the text, it's, I think, clear that he's not existentially ill at ease. He's not afraid. He's not sweating blood in the wilderness, because all of those are lies he sees through instantly. I think he's like a little boy laughing them off, right? The garden is different. And I
Okay.
think Maximus is right here, right? That Jesus is genuinely afraid. He is terrified. Not because he's terrified of losing the Father or losing himself, but because the human nature he's assumed for our sake is rightly terrified by death. I mean, now we're back to Bulgakov, right? What he feels in the horror of that image, the frozen dying, right? Like that, Jesus, I think, is experiencing that infinitely, right? It to the fullest extent of his personhood. So I would contend then that he's never choosing, that what's happening in that moment is that he's always willing the will of God. He's not choosing, again, from a menu of options, and he's certainly not choosing between obeying and disobeying. I don't, there was a time, the question was, could Jesus have sinned? I remember in Bible school, we had to debate this question.
Mhm.
And at that point in my life, I said and kept insisting he must have been able to sin, because otherwise it isn't genuine. And what I would say now is that was a failure of imagination on my part, that there is a way in which there's something that for us would be like risk. There's genuineness to it, right? There's surprise, but not in any sense of failing, right? So, and here I'm going to appeal to Jensen again, that I think God is capable of surprising God without there being ignorance in God.
Mm-hmm.
And that there is a way in which Jesus is willing, he's personally willing, but he's not choosing from a range of options. And he's not choosing whether or not to obey, but he is personalizing how his obedience will happen. And
Mm-hmm.
that's what's surprising. That what surprises the Father and delights the Father is not that Jesus obeys, but how he obeys. That there's this sense of, he did that. Like who knows? I mean, I'm thinking, for instance, when Jesus spits on the ground and makes poultices to put on the man's eyes. I
Yeah.
mean, I like to think that this delighted, the angels and the archangels and the saints and God himself, right? That God is delighted at what this son of his has done. And I'm not sure if that's touching exactly what you're talking about, but I want to make those kinds of distinctions. I think there is willing in God. I think there is surprise in God. There's so much will that Jesus can surprise, and yet it's not choosing in the sense of arbitrariness. What I'm taking to be what
Right.
Maximus means
Right.
by the gnomic.
Right. 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 Yeah. I think. I think that kind of gets to what I was talking about. Thank you.
Okay.
So I don't want to get back. I want to get back to the distinction between death and dying that Bulgakov makes just briefly, because this is something that I actually have personal experience with. When I was 14, I went into respiratory arrest from an asthma attack. And I was absolutely terrified because I could not breathe, and I was certain that I was dying and that I was going to die. And at some point, and it was just terror. It was horrible. Like I can still remember what it felt like. And at some point, like shortly before the paramedics arrived, it went from this like, I'm dying, this is miserable, to like, oh, I'm going to die, but everything will be okay. And this just like, and all the anxiety went out of me in that moment. And then shortly after that, the paramedics showed up.
Wow.
So to me, there's definitely like, I've had this experiential distinction of like when you're looking at the threshold, like once you've gotten past the terror of dying. So I think that would be like the difference between like the Gethsemane moment that you were just talking about, right? Where there's no, like, even for Jesus, there's genuine terror of dying.
Yes.
And that it is finished.
Yes. Into your hands I give my spirit.
Exactly. And yes, exactly. So that is that very, like, Jesus expresses that very difference. And I think that's what Bulgakov in Sophiology of Death, I think that's what he's trying to
I like that. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. I think that this may be a footnote to the point you're making, but I do believe we've done a lot of damage by telling people that, we wouldn't call it this, but that's sin has wrecked our knowing. The noetic effects of sin have made it so that we can't trust. I mean, we love to quote Jeremiah, the heart is desperately wicked above all things, right? Who can know it? And the God's ways are not our ways, his thoughts are above our thoughts, right? From Isaiah. And I think the truth is there are moments in which we know. I think about David Bentley Hart talking about as a kid, hearing talk about hell, and he knows.
Yeah.
That's not right. Like
I had the same experience, by the way. This is like, I was always an intuitive universalist. And I blame it's my Pentecostal mother's fault for reading me George MacDonald when I was very young. So it's your fault, Mom.
Yeah.
By the way, my Pentecostal mother, I shared your sermon, God is not a master, with my mother. And to my surprise, she actually loved it.
Oh, wow. I'm glad to know you were setting me up to get me in trouble with your mother.
She absolutely loved it.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, but I like that. And I think one of the reasons is I was very attached to my grandfather. And my grandfather he believed in God, but he was not a church person. Like, he believed in God. I mean, it's just like like what we call the nuns these days, like spiritual, not religious, like believed in God in some vague sense and thought you should be a good person, but was not a churchgoer. And it's like the minute people told me that my grandfather was going to hell, and that was like my favorite person in the world and one of the best people I've ever known, who would do anything.
Your heart knows that can't be
would do for anything for anyone in need anytime he had a chance. Like, I'm like, oh, that's bullshit. Like, that was like, there's no way. It's like, because it's, and it's, I ended up out of the church for a long time, but I never lost sight of the Jesus that I saw when I read the scriptures that wouldn't have supported what I was being told it was necessary to believe. So I can identify with David saying that, because I didn't have to come, there was no hard struggle to come to universalism for me. In my case, it was like, oh, okay, if I have to believe this in order to be part of the church, then I just don't want to be part of the church.
Yeah. Well, and I brought that up, exactly. And I brought that up because I think your experience as a 14-year-old kid is telling the truth in two ways, right? So first, you feel the natural revulsion to death. And I think that is like, you were experiencing something of that same terror Jesus himself tasted, right? Now, in the language of Hebrews, he tasted death for everyone. And I argue that you can actually, like, theologically, that is saying not only that he tasted death for us, but he tasted the death of everyone.
Yeah.
Right. Like he's taken your death in. And so I think your heart was giving you.
And I was alone. And Bulgakov talks about this in Sociology. He talks about how alone he was during the process of dying. But the minute there was that transition from I'm dying to like, oh, I'm going to die, this is happening, I felt like I wasn't alone. Like I was actually hearing like an odd, essentially an audible voice telling me it will be okay.
It will be okay. Yeah. And I think that those things are things we've come to distrust. And I think by we here, I don't just mean the Christian folks that have raised me and that I've lived with. I mean culturally in the quote unquote West.
Right, yeah. Because we'll just say, well, that was just because your brain was deprived of oxygen and this is what was going on if we made a map of your brain and this portion of your brain. Yeah. But that's bullshit.
Absolutely. Yes.
At some level, we all know it is.
Yes. It's telling us something fundamentally true. And, I think I think when God slows down processes for us, or we're experiencing them, and God allows us to experience them with a kind of awareness, I think we learn these things, right? That what you were learning in that moment was both dying is an evil, but to be dead is not to be abandoned.
Right.
To be dead is to be with the Lord. Both of those things are true.
Resurrection requires death. There's what happens to Jesus is not the same as what Jesus does to Lazarus.
Oh, that's right.
Lazarus is raised from the dead. Jesus is resurrected. They're not the same thing.
No, that's right.
So we have to we have to kind of reconcile ourselves to we can be genuinely afraid of dying. I'm not saying we shouldn't be, but death itself is something that we need to be reconciled to, because death is the very gateway to resurrection.
Right. And yes, that's right. And death is a way of acknowledging our limits. So I've been writing this piece now for a while on a theology of death. It'll be a book at some point, hopefully, Lord willing, we'll see. But one of the things that I argue in there is that finitude isn't what we're ultimately meant for, but it's not an evil. I think we're meant to be capable, and we are becoming infinitized, but finitude is not an evil. Limits are not bad inherently. And therefore, there is a way in which death as rest can be good. So not only in the sense that we go to be with God and the saints, but in the sense that our life now is complete. And Ronner convinced me of this, right? That without death, a life isn't finished yet. And an unfinished life is not yet a life that is recognizable as holy, as full. It's not entirely sanctified, to use language that I grew up with. A life needs to finish. And something that finishes, and I try to make the distinction between a life that comes to its end versus a life that is interrupted. So my grandparents, I was very close with my grandparents as well, and they both passed away. And even though, of course, I miss them, and watching them die was painful, their death did not rupture their communion in my life or our communion as a family, because they died, I think, without any unfinished business. Right? Their lives came to an end, but not too early, not in a way that kept work that needed to happen from happening. Right? And that, so I think that's a blessed death. And I think we need to make sure we don't lose sight of that. Unfortunately, so much talk over the last 15 or 20 years has been, for reasons we can discuss, has been about death as the enemy of God, that we've missed the ways in which there is a way of a life being finished, a life coming to its rest, a life accepting its finitude. All of that is good and is a necessary step in the movement toward.
It brings together our two different visions of the eschaton too, right? Because you have this, there's the idea of peace, of resting in the peace of God,
Yes.
But then you have the idea of the further up and further in.
Mm-hmm.
So so they're like, that kind of acknowledges that need for that transitional state.
And I think that's right. I think that's right. And I think even, I mean, to use a hypothetical, even if there had been no sin, there would have been an end to our lives. Because without that end, I don't think resurrection is possible. So the resurrection, the way that if I'm teaching this in class, what I'll do sometimes is draw a line on the board and say, that timeline represents a life. Resurrection is not another point added on after the end of the timeline. And it's not a lengthening of the timeline, right? And it's not another timeline, right? You don't jump from this one to another one. Resurrection is the taking of that whole timeline up into the infinity of God.
Yeah, that's good.
My whole life translated into the fullness of God's goodness and sovereignty and care for all creatures. And that, I think, is why, whether we call it death or simply the finishing of our lives, there has to be a completion. Our lives have to complete in order for that to even be possible, right? And I think, of course, sin is the sting of death. Like death has a kind of victory over us. It is an enemy of God in that it is exerting power over us. But there's an analogy here with birth, right? Maximus on the virgin birth, that Mary is with child, but not in a way that violates anything in her, right? And she's with child, she's chosen, right? All other mothers have a child they don't know yet. They meet the child when the child is born. But Mary is one who is given, and she knows the one who she's going to bear before she bears him. And that awareness not only means there's no violence there, it also means that she's experiencing pregnancy, she's experiencing motherhood, but without any of the coercion or any of the corruption that dominates all of our experience. I think something like that is true of death as well. And this is why the tradition has said about her death, right, that it's different. In East and West, there's an agreement. I mean, Bulgakov's,
right,
I think, terrific on this, right? There's a way in which her death is different, not because, like, I mean, we're allergic to that for whatever reason. I mean, we should have another conversation someday about Mary and Mariology, but I think
this is my rosary. You're not going to upset me.
The instinct, the tradition is right here, that Mary, as mother and as the one who's dying, shows us that these things do not have to be experienced the way we know them, in blood, in terror, that the life God made for us is not the life we're experiencing. So I'll quote Bonhoeffer here: through the fall, creation became nature. And much of what, the romantic in us celebrates as God's work is not God's work. It's God's work fractured. It's what has become of God's work because of sin and the work of evil and death in the world. But in these moments, especially the life of Mary, we do see what it can be otherwise, right? There's still finality, right? There's still an end, but it's an end that doesn't rupture.
Well, there's a way in which, you might think I'm crazy for saying this, but there's a way in which the whore of Babylon and the woman clothed in the sun are both images of nature.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Say more.
Well, okay. So let's see if I can articulate this. The whore of Babylon represents like spoiled nature and fall. And I would say, since this is a conversation about beauty, it is beauty that is not the real, like, it's what we think is beauty, right? The whore of Babylon is appealing. She's enticing. She offers us the things that we think that we want. Whereas the woman clothed in the sun, who definitely is clearly connected to the Blessed Virgin, represents the true beauty that is potential in all of nature.
Well, yeah, so maybe I could, if I use Bonhoeffer a little bit, I'll use him my way. So I think we've got creation, we've got nature, and we've got the unnatural. So nature is always being pulled either toward the created again, in which the image of Christ is being realized in it, or down into the unnatural, or away into the unnatural, where it's being more and more disfigured. And so I think that the givenness of things, the way things actually happen, like that is nature. But then it has to be perceived and received. It has to be acted upon, indwelt, and that's where we either do it in ways that are glorifying. I mean, I'm hardly the first to draw attention to this, but I mean, in Romans 8, creation is groaning and longing, waiting for us to be manifested, right? So I think every tree, every animal of the field, all of it around me, it's groaning, waiting on me to notice it the way I should notice it, and to sing it the way I should sing it, and to indwell it the way I should indwell it, right? I love to think about this with the way Jesus interacts with nature when he walks on water, or when he's buried in it, as he at the baptism. That nature, the water, is actually cooperating with him. Like it's being personalized by him in such a way that it's deciding that I want to do what he wants done. I want to hold him up so that he can walk, or I want to hold him under so he can share the fate of Pharaoh, as Bob Ekblad has said. And I think something like that is true of the pigs. Like, why do the pigs run off the cliff once they're demonized? Because they're cooperating with Jesus, fighting the demonic, right? They do not want to be, they're not going to give their lives to be eaten up by these. And it's their cooperation within the fig tree. Mm-hmm. I wrote a poem once, a little poem about a disciple coming to the fig tree, and the disciples bothered about, how could you let Jesus curse you? Was it hard for you to let Jesus curse you? And the fig tree laughs and says, that was my idea. Right. And it's a silly little poem, but it's pointing at this point, right? That I think that nature, in that's the sense you're using it, is attuned to God, right? In Maximus's sense, like it knows its logos, right? Every creature knows, it recognizes the word of the word that is its life. And as human beings, we ought to speak that to creatures. I could get really weird here really fast, so you can redirect me. But that's
no, that's great. That's great. Thank you, Chris. I think I think this is good for a first conversation. Let's put a bow on it.
Okay.
And call it a wrap. It was really great talking to you. I hope we'll have a chance to talk again sometime.
Absolutely, man. Thanks. I really appreciate it. What's your process? I don't know. You can just text me or whenever it comes through.
Yeah, I'll let you know when it comes out. I'll make sure to put a link to your book in the description notes, and I'll let you. I'll contact.
And I'll bump it on my platforms too, so you can. I mean, I'm sure I've got people who are hearing me that haven't heard you yet. So
absolutely,
that's why I'm asking, so I can make that connection for you.
Yep, I'll get it to you as soon as I have it ready.